As climate change exacerbates disasters and crises around the world, erases coastlines, and dries water, a major challenge will emerge over the coming decades. Billions of people will need to move to areas that are safer. Some of this migration will be across national lines, but much of it will be interregional, and quite a lot will take place entirely within the United States. In a new book on climate migration, environmental journalist and Pulitzer Prize finalist Abrahm Lustgarten argues that over the coming decades, we'll see fundamental rearrangements in where, domestically, food is produced, communities will form, and where productivity will be highest, all as a result of our changing climate. Today, we're sitting down with Abram to go deeper into the consequences and what the future might hold, and how to prepare for the next great migration that will take hold and has possibly already started within our borders. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Today I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Campana, who is the director of the Center for Environmental Studies at Rice University, and we're sitting down with Abrahm to talk about his new book. Abrahm Lustgarten is an investigative reporter who has written for ProPublica, the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Scientific. His journalism after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was turned into a frontline documentary, and his series on drought in the American West was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His new book, On the Move, The Overheating Earth and the Uprooting of America, was just released and is now available wherever books are sold. Abrahm Lustgarten, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So I'm so delighted to get to chat with you today. I know Joe and I have both been really excited about both the work that you're doing and what you're thinking around, but also the opportunity to really kind of dive into the weeds a little bit around how you're thinking of climate migration. So just to start us off, I'd love to hear a little bit, if you could define for us, maybe first what climate migration even means, and then what particularly got you thinking around this topic and investigating it to begin with.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your interest. Climate migration is the premise, the fact that people will move, change where they live in response to changing environmental conditions, that they'll naturally seek an environment that is supportive of their livelihoods, if they're agriculturally oriented or just personal preference for a certain type of climate, and that as those conditions change, and particularly with the pressures of climate change, that will influence where people decide to live and ultimately provoke them to move. And it's a subtle influence. I always describe it as rarely the primary reason why people move, but always among the reasons why people move. And it's sort of, it layers with economic forces and romantic forces and, persecution and conflict globally. There's a lot of reasons why people move and why populations move, but climate migration, is a response of those populations to changes in their environment.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that you highlight in the book is that, and we can get into broader conversations, some of which we've actually discussed in the program before around this idea of like climate refugees, right? And how nebulous a term that is because it's really hard to pin down and really attribute. But there are specific instances that you are pointing to where you're really demonstrating both within the U.S. and abroad that we really can attribute migrational movements of people directly to a changing climate.
Yeah, we have seen, people have always moved in response to their climate from the beginning of humans. In recent times, we can associate some of our major migrations to climate-influenced changes. The war in Syria, the conflict in Syria is an example that's often cited where, drought in rural parts of Syria forced out communities that were dependent on livestock, which weren't surviving through that drought period, and moved more people to the cities in Syria, and ultimately more of those people who moved to the cities were engaged in the fight for their freedoms and the fight against the Syrian government, and that conflict, which was not climate driven but was climate influenced, led to one of the largest movements of migrants into Europe in 2015. So a couple million people moving into Europe, and that had all sorts of destabilizing effects, including among the causes for UK's exit from the European Union, political upheaval in Germany, which accepted a lot of those migrants. So we see those influences, and we've seen examples elsewhere. Chinese moving northward into Russian territories in pursuit of agricultural opportunities and things like that.
You also demonstrate, though, examples in the U.S. and some right here on the Gulf Coast where we are. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you're already seeing this play out in a domestic context.
Yeah, so the easiest way to measure what is generally a difficult trend to measure is to look at displacement from disasters. It's the one place where we have some kind of idea of a certain, of a group of people affected at a specific point in time, and we can see whether they've come or gone. And so the internal displacement monitoring center is one of the primary measures of that kind of movement, and their numbers for displaced people in the United States has markedly increased over the last couple of years. It's gone from numbers in a couple hundred thousands in the early 2000s, 2008-ish, to now between 1.5 and 3 million displaced Americans a year, and that corresponds to an increasing number of substantial disasters, hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, wildfires in California, and things like that. And so those are the fast-moving, disastrous displacement of people, and there are a number of stories now of what happens when the town of Paradise, California, burns, and its 30-odd thousand residents, leave almost overnight, and there's research that has tracked where they go, and that is a form of climate displacement that's happening in the United States. And then there's the slow onset disasters, the sort of the slow change of climate change, and how that's beginning to affect communities in the United States. And there, too, we're seeing mostly along the coast that are most affected from sea level rise. We're starting to see communities displaced by rising floodwaters. And Louisiana is the primary example of that. There was both the extraordinary displacement of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but also the slow displacement of what's happened to communities along the coast from both the combination of land subsidence and rising seas, which has forced resettlement of a number of communities. Ile de Jean Charles is one community there that I spent some time in.
This is the community that's often heralded as the home of the first climate refugees in the country, right?
Yeah, the sort of primary example, earliest example of government-sponsored retreat, of an organized retreat, where they took a community, they poured some funds into it. Not an easy thing. There's lots of politics that were involved in this short story, but the ultimate end of that story is that they took this community and they tried to resettle it intact about 40 miles to the north. There are less organized stories like that unfolding all over the Southeast at this point, along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, Georgia, North Carolina, places where we are starting to finally see regular and intensive increases in coastal flooding.
Abrahm, if I might ask, I was thinking a lot about it's just sort of an incredible read, and also the way that the sections bring us through so many kinds of so many of the impetuses for movement, fires, flooding, sure, and disasters. I was thinking though a lot about. wanted to ask what might seem like a naive question, but when was it that heat became part of the focus? I was thinking, 10 years ago, were there a book like this? Would it have felt mostly about flooding? Would it have felt mostly about shorelines? And behind all of this, you identify heat. And I just would love to hear a little bit how that came into the way you framed the whole book.
Well, the book identifies, and in reporting the book, I identified 2020 as a sort of a turning point. And it's a little bit of an artificial turning point because we could, I think at this point, grab onto any moment in time and say this is a critical year in how we're experiencing climate change. But at that point, there was a newness in the last couple of years that preceded that. 2017, 2018 saw extraordinary wildfires, extraordinary storms, Harvey here in Houston, among the things that happened around 2020 were incredible heat waves. So I forget the exact years, but there was the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, and there was Arizona's incredible string of temperatures above 115 degrees. I think 52 days above 115 degrees, and that was a year where all of these things happened. But it was a year where the public just kind of experienced them, recognized them for what they are, began talking about them in a way that seemed to cross political divides. It wasn't a climate change issue. It wasn't an activist issue so much as it was a disaster, one after another. It was in the front pages of the New York Post the New York Times and the Washington Post, just about every day. And very anecdotally, this is not a scientific conclusion, but it seemed to be a turning point in our consciousness. And I think that so the heat waves of Arizona that year, and then in the years since then, have really just like increasingly brought it to the fore.
Yeah, it is. It's incredible how, yes, there's a way to say that heat is behind so many environmental dilemmas right now, but at the same time, the visibility of it has been on a kind of shocking uptick in the last 5 years. And because it's tied to circumstances, the incredible heat waves in Europe, right, as well, suddenly hitting. One way that I index it every year when I teach our undergraduates and I talk about things in the news, and I will look back from year to year, and from 2018 to the present, the uptick in reporting on heat has been kind of incredible.
Well, and I mean, you have some numbers in the book, and around Arizona specifically, you mentioned the fact that in 2020 there were 522 deaths in Arizona directly attributed to heat, which is the average national for the country, what we'd normally have, which I mean is shocking just to think about one state suddenly matching a national average of heat-related deaths. And when you were talking earlier about these kind of slow forces, I mean, this is one of the exact things I was immediately jumping to. So thanks, Joe, for bringing in heat. But I mean, that's, I think, one of these things underlying, everything we're getting at. But certainly also these other forces that, have maybe felt like weather previously, and we're now just recognizing based on frequency and extremity are the climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think we make this distinction between disasters and then sort of slow onset changes. And the slow changes, they're almost imperceptible. And their imperceptibility is part of why we've had a really difficult time recognizing climate change. And so we talk about global warming and climate change generally being a warming thing. So in a way, the conversation's always been about heat, but the connection between what those heat changes are in fractions of degrees and the storms or the wildfires has always been really, really difficult to make. And I think that's why that shift, around 2017 to 2022 in the number of heat waves in the United States, and of course you mentioned Europe as well, but in our myopic, culture here, we really just began to feel what that means. Difference between a heat wave that's the summer heat wave that we're all familiar with, and we go to the beach and jump in the ocean, versus a heat wave that kills people, that keeps people indoors, that makes their energy bills skyrocket, might make their lifestyle unaffordable, and is just difficult to live through.
Well, and I think that gets to something that that's a great outline of these various causes that are underlying and kind of driving this migrational pattern. But as we think about that migration, something that you write about pretty extensively is this idea of habitable zones and this idea of where people can actually live on the planet. And at one point you mentioned, historically, most places have been pretty available to us, that it's like 1% that kind of sit outside that temperature zone that we really, just are uninhabitable. But by 2070, that'll be 20%. And of course, I'm thinking a little beyond that, and I'm like, okay, so 1% is uninhabitable based on certain conditions, but also, how much of that is also we're not going to live on top of mountains. There's other places that are just not viable, and so people are going to move, but it means this real restricting of where people are going to really be able to exist and exist comfortably. So I'm wondering if you can talk us through this coming shift of how you're seeing, maybe globally, certainly in the U.S., where is that movement going to start taking place?
So there's this fascinating set of studies that have looked at human habitat from sort of a biosphere ecosystem perspective, not necessarily a climate change perspective, and just tried to identify where it is that humans have traditionally lived on the planet. And what they found is that for the past 6,000 years, there's a niche of a certain range of temperature and a certain range of precipitation that most populations, the largest populations, have generally gravitated towards. And that's been fairly steady state for the past 6,000 years, and now it is starting to dramatically change. And as it changes, that niche, they call it the habitability niche, the human suitability niche, is moving towards the poles. And because of the landmass of the planet, that basically means for people, it's moving northward. And so two things are happening. Obviously, the conditions that we would seek out are moving northward, so we might find better living conditions in the north. But also, as that niche moves, it happens to be affecting the most populated parts of the planet first. The equatorial regions, the Sahel of North Africa, straight through the heart of Central Asia, for example, or South Asia. And these are the largest populations on the planet. So as that niche moves, it is leaving people outside of it. And that's a shift that is displacing from an ideal habitat tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people very quickly. It is also affecting the United States and North America. We are not as severely affected as the places I just mentioned, and the impacts for us here will never be what they are for people in those parts of the world. But it is measurably and plainly affecting how habitable different parts of the United States are as well. And what that means for the United States is that, the sweet spot that was around the middle of the country for the past 6,000 years is shifting towards the northern part of the country. Depending on how quickly the planet warms, it could shift right up to the Canadian border and over the border. And as it does that, the places that are becoming more marginal, not quite slipping out of the niche by the study, but no big surprise to Americans, the marginal regions are, South Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. And from a heat and a precipitation perspective, really the southern half or the southern quarter of the United States.
I was thinking a lot as I read the book about. We started earlier talking a little bit about visibility, some of these issues becoming more and more apparent, especially in recent years and recent reporting. And one thing that I think recurs is the idea that climate migration, what will it look like exactly? How fast is it? At what extent? And that in fact, for the most part right now, we're talking about largely kind of small movements, in fact. And I think if I remember correctly, you were saying that in at least in some parts of the globe, climate migration might mean moving 6 miles, as opposed to, I think, the kind of the fantasy or the terror of like hordes of people kind of crossing the globe, which is impractical anyway. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how some of those flows will look and over what period of years you think this is all going to be playing out.
Yeah, so the mechanism of the past patterns of climate migration, or of all types of migration, are what researchers refer to as a sort of a stepwise pattern, which basically means that people generally prefer to move the shortest distance possible while maintaining or achieving whatever it is that they're seeking. So, in rural communities in Guatemala, which I spent some time in, the preference of a community in a village that was suffering from drought would first be to move to, the larger village 10 miles down the road, then to Guatemala City. And only if their needs were unmet or the pressure is too great or the economic opportunities elsewhere too great, would they then move on. And you see that kind of pattern reflected also in the way the research looks at this issue. Like the World Bank has done the leading work on global climate migration, and it's issued a number of reports, and each of those reports look at and model numbers for climate migrants within countries. And they really stop short of projecting, how many of those people will move beyond borders. But at some point, people will move beyond borders, depending on the security and the stability, the economic opportunity, and the environments of whatever countries or regions they're in. And that's where, you start to have questions about how many people will move from Central America to the United States against the southern border, or how many more people will move from North Africa into Europe and things like that. And it gets to be very difficult to predict. the time scale, as you mentioned, is also a really difficult thing to talk about. A lot of this conversation is based off of modeling that is in itself uncertain. I like to think of it as an arrow pointing in a direction and not much more precise than that, but it should give us a sense of sort of the scale and the general direction, but no sense of precision. But it models over many, many decades, and it's true that we are seeing climate migration begin in the United States right now, and I think that that's really significant and an important part of the conversation. But the larger kind of changes, the transformation of the United States that I see, as a result of these shifts in our environment, are things that are going to, evolve slowly over the rest of our lifetimes and the entire course of, my children's lifetime. So we're talking about a slow-moving change where you might not see the reality of the image that first comes to mind when we talk about climate migration until the middle or second part of the century. So it's really you have to adjust your perception a little bit to a slow-moving change.
I think something that you point at in the book, building off of that, this idea that we already are seeing a trickle of migration happening. I think you refer to it as at one point. But, certain places, you had mentioned Ile-de-Jean-Charles and the, government relocation of that community. But a broader theme of the book is it's not going to be possible to relocate everyone who's going to need relocation. You mentioned drought, and I'm thinking of communities in the West. I'm thinking of communities in Texas that, are really at a major risk of drought. And what happens when, we don't have access or easy access to water in many of these places, and how we're going to have to rethink water policy. And so I'm curious about, who are going to be the most impacted communities as these changes continue to develop. And, any thoughts you have on the economic impacts, but especially on what the government's role will be and how much we're going to be able to assist communities that are suddenly facing, far too often flooding, far too often drought, far too often these kind of calamitous scenarios that make habitability so incredibly difficult.
So you want to wrap all of the most difficult, depressing aspects of this topic into one
I thought
big
we could
question.
just get over all the terrible stuff in one go if we could.
Yeah. All right, I'll take a shot at it. Well, the changing environmental pressures that we're talking about are going to exacerbate all of the divisions and vulnerabilities that our society has now. And they're going to affect, what that means is they're going to disproportionately affect the poorest among us, people of color, Black, Latino, minority communities, in large part because those communities have already been underattended to or unattended to for generations before this moment, which has left them weaker in the face of the challenges that are coming. And so, we see from an urban perspective, for example, the lingering impact of redlining in communities from the 1930s.
Can you explain what that is really quick in case some folks aren't familiar with the term?
Redlining was the banking and insurance process of rating certain neighborhoods in urban areas for their suitability for loans, for the estimating the ability of the people who lived in those places to provide a return on investment for the banks. But it basically graded Black and minority communities as substandard, not worth investing in, and white, more professional communities as the high standard, worth investing in. And that's had these, echoing ripple effects in all of the decades since that has left neighborhoods in Los Angeles, for example, Black neighborhoods with less tree cover and more pavement than wealthier white communities. And as the climate warms, that's just one example. Across the country, these underprivileged communities are more vulnerable to flooding. They're less protected by new infrastructure investment, and so
property values are typically always much lower. Yes, all of these myriad economic and real consequences.
Yeah, they self-perpetuate and spiral into one another. So if your property values are low because of legacy racist policies, then you also have less equity and assets to work with to respond to the current crisis, and less mobility as a result. And in terms of heat, in the Los Angeles example, or in any hot city example, those neighborhoods are literally 5 to 10 degrees hotter than than white and better protected neighborhoods, and that translates to a whole other host of problems, including higher rates of cardiac arrest and higher rates of mortality. So it's literally killing people. And as we go forward, the dramatic effects of all sorts of climate change, from flooding to wildfires to heat, will, prey on the more vulnerable, and the less vulnerable will have greater resilience to those changes. And in many parts of the country, that includes just rural, impoverished white communities as well. It's worth noting. And the second, I think, aspect of this is that, as you suggested, dealing with adjusting to these climate pressures is going to be unbelievably expensive, and how well we do that is going to be determined by how much investment is available to do that. And the difficult reality of this conversation, I think, is that inevitably there will be many places in the United States and in the world that can't afford to make those investments, and never will. And the people who live there, either by choice or because they lack mobility, will be sort of trapped as the climate gets worse and as the economies of their communities kind of spiral downward in this self-perpetuating negative feedback loop. And that will, unfortunately, I think, really divide the climate haves and climate have-nots as we look at migration going forward. The largest waves of climate migrants are going to be the people with the most means to migrate, either younger, most energetic, with the most means and the most wealth, seeking jobs, or because they can afford to own property in different places and things like that. And the people who don't have those privileges will be left behind.
Some of what's really incredible and on the move, I found, is the way that you put climate migration, current conditions, but also anticipated future ones, in the context of other large movements of people in the history of the United States, particularly the Great Migration of African Americans to the North in the decades in the wake of emancipation. And as you talk now, too, about divisions kind of growing more and more intense. I wonder if you talk a little bit about how you see those these large-scale migrations in our history, but also the ones in our future, resonating with one another.
Yeah, this is simply the idea that large-scale, unpredictable change, in our society could have and is likely to have really kind of exciting and transformative, positive, culturally shaping aspects. And we don't know exactly what that will be or what it will look like. But our past migrations give a clue. So the largest migration, the Great Migration in the United States, was the movement of 6 to 7 million black people, former slaves, out of the South and towards the North, and that changed all of the northern cities, northeastern cities, Los Angeles as well. But it created really, cities like Baltimore, the identity of cities like Baltimore and Detroit, and to a large extent Chicago. And along with that came a transformation of many things that we identify with now as American culture, but really they were Black culture, where they sprung out of of the new new freedoms and new spaciousness that that those people had creatively when they came to their new homes. So so much of our literature, our sports, our arts, our music, can be tied to that kind of migration. To that period in American history, and to a much smaller extent, but a similar kind of pattern. You can see that in the migration out of the Plain States during the Dust Bowl, where a couple million people left the Great Plains and moved to California, moved to places like Bakersfield, the Central Valley, and the Central Coast around Salinas, and transformed, the politics and the culture of what California is today as an agricultural state. It was so much shaped by, the millions of people that came out of, the Great Plains and the homesteading culture of that part of the country.
Something that you really hint at is, that speaking a little bit of culture here and moving us back to the Gulf Coast where we currently are, is this idea that as climate changes, as people move, there's, as you mentioned, these kind of haves and have-nots of climate change. that some of the complexity around that is communities that are really tied to forces that are going to undergo a lot of change, oil and gas, industrial agricultural farming, right, particularly here in the South, and really trying to be attentive to how do we rethink these communities, how do we ensure that there are jobs. And so I'm curious about some of these transitional strategies. So we look at places that we know are going to be experiencing, both the impacts of climate change, but also the impacts of the economic realities of how climate change will drive these myriad forces in our cultural, social, economic life to change. What are some of the ways we should be attentive to thinking about protecting these communities or developing new resources for communities we know are going to be at greater risk?
Yeah, I think it's early days in terms of solutions to the kind of to these questions. But some of the ideas that I hear coming up in my conversations, they range from recognizing the importance of the cohesiveness of a community and how harmful it is to those people in the community to kind of have their friends, family, neighbors, it just dissolve across the country into different places. Mm-hmm. And so, somebody that I spent some time working with suggested the idea of sister cities, for example, or sister communities, where a northern destination community might pair with a vulnerable community in the southern United States and designate itself as a destination point, so that as a decade unfolds and people in a vulnerable small town in the South are reconsidering where to live, they might know that there's a pattern that they can reclaim at least some of their relationships and some of their community if they all move to some smaller town in Michigan, for example. So that's sort of one creative way of thinking about the challenge. There's a lot of people thinking in the South and the Southeast right now just about how you marry the goals of a future that's more equitable than the past with the pressures and the transitions that we're talking about. And a part of that conversation is about recognizing people's economic reliance on industries that we're trying to phase out as a solution to climate change, and whether that's like logging in Georgia or oil and gas in Louisiana or mining, in Tennessee. So there's a recognition of the importance of both diversifying the economies of these communities and somehow, and this is a really difficult, not an easy thing to solve, but somehow replacing those sources of employment over time, as we seek sort of from a larger national policy perspective to phase out dirty industries. So a recognition that a lot of the most vulnerable people in a lot of the most vulnerable places also happen to be dependent on a lot of already struggling, very dirty economies and industries that we're hoping to replace. And that if you don't see that with a little bit of foresight and plan for that transition in some way, that there's a real amplifying of disaster for those communities. So those are two ways. And and then from a policy standpoint, you're going to have to see federal, state, and local government invest in those transitions, and then just invest in general. I mean, I just think that all of these facets of change are going to require extraordinary amounts of money.
Well, and to the point of money and to the point of this kind of federal intervention, I want to backtrack a little bit actually to something that I think was part of a starting point of this book, which is insurance. And I think, I know you're in California and thinking about insurance woes around wildfires in the Gulf South. Florida's had a state system for a while because of insurance issues. I know everyone I know in Louisiana and Texas has talked about over the last couple of years insurance doubling and, fewer and fewer options to insure homes. And so I'm curious about, both the role of insurance that you argue, I think, effectively, as others have, in exacerbating some of these concerns as a kind of shield for seeing what the actual risk of where we're living is, but also what must be done, what can be done in the way of ensuring that people are able to actually have homes, especially in a country where we've built so much of our economy around home ownership as a means of wealth creation, and seeing communities who are desperately trying to end that, who historically have been excluded from it. What are methods of protecting our homes, especially here in the Gulf South, where it's something we think a lot about?
Yeah, one of the trends that you see right now, present present contemporary moment in the United States as we talk about climate migration is that people are still moving to the places where, I think they're most vulnerable. The 9 out of the 10 fastest growing regions in the United States are the most vulnerable to the climate pressures that we're talking about. And so, we have to ask why. And one of the reasons is that for a long time, we as a country have, collectively incentivized through a lot of different mechanisms people to move to those places. We've subsidized the costs and the risks of moving to those places, and as a result, blunted the consequences of it. So it seems safer to move to Arizona. It seems safer to move to the coast of California than it really is. And the largest of those subsidies has been insurance, property insurance in particular. And what has essentially happened is states have created public plans that have provided insurance to people where the free market, our capitalistic insurance companies that we all know so well have determined that there's no viable business for them, that they can't insure properties. And so states have stepped in and said, if we don't provide insurance ourselves, then people might leave. And we don't want them to leave because it affects the economic future of our communities. It affects our growth. It affects our representation in Congress if we lose enough people and so on. And so states, largely beginning in Florida, created these subsidized plans called FAIR plans, fair access to insurance plans. And they make insurance cheap, and they make it available to anybody who needs it, regardless of the growing environmental threat. And 30-odd states have now adopted similar plans. And they're meant as both a backstop to the loss of insurance, which can be devastating, but also as a stimulus to encourage more growth and more building and more expansion into risky areas. And so, as you said, they serve an important purpose. They shore up and stabilize communities that could potentially lose everything. But then, unfortunately, they also encourage more growth in places where I think by now we can look at climate data and the cost of disasters and the cost to communities and say that growth shouldn't be continuing. And so I think the challenge is how do you those systems and those incentives are beginning to reverse and change. And the question is, how do you change them in a way that kind of honors both of those functions? And that's going to be a difficult thing to unwind. I think the answer is going to lie somewhere in this sort of pairing of continuing to provide subsidies to support communities that don't want to be displaced or that need that support, while somehow ceasing to use those subsidies to encourage new growth and enlarge, the dangers. So, I'm from California, and we look at this from a California perspective. The state's growing its subsidized insurance coverage of communities facing wildfire risk. And for me, my home was built 65 years ago. There's a robust community that may need to rely on subsidized insurance to remain there as commercial insurers are backing out of the state. But California has seen really aggressive, explosive growth in these suburban areas that are pushing into wildfire risk zones over the last 2 decades. More and more building, right up into the foothills of mountains, right up into the mountains, straight into the heart of places, not just that are going to burn more as the climate warms, but places that have always burned periodically. And when those disasters happen, people die. It costs the states billions of dollars. Those are the kind of developments that need to be avoided and not supported by the fact that the state's willing to provide insurance to anybody who wants to go sort of build a home in the wrong place.
There's also a way, as you're talking, I was thinking about some of the reporting that was happening, let's say 5, 6, 7 years ago. Not the first knowledge of sea level rise, but it was certainly hitting a lot. And there was a lot about coastlines eroding, and there was a lot about southern Florida, for instance. And then there also seemed to be unleashed a kind of orgy of property buying, of kind of coastline expensive property. So there also seem to be these very strange ways of kind of trying to use up before it goes, right? And so expensive property sort of deals happening in an area that's obviously so threatened. The fantasy that Miami was going to be like a Bitcoin capital of the universe. I mean, there was all sorts of high-end economic fantasies too that sometimes fuel what are some deeply problematic and improbable behaviors. So it seemed to be there are many registers on which anxiety, fear, panic, thrill-seeking, kind of weird, odd behaviors seem to be happening right around kind of climate disasters, whether they're sort of slow-moving or faster ones.
I mean, I think so. Part of the equation for why people live in dangerous places in the United States is also that we are just attracted to sunshine and the coasts and these beautiful places. And then there's also this speculative nature of everything that we're talking about. And so, whether it's like a Bitcoin boom or a property boom or whatever, there are all sorts of countervailing forces. Insurance is not the only one, and subsidies are not the only problem, but they're layered, in this larger system. And part of when you talk about property or the development, along, parts of the Florida coast that I think are particularly doomed, for example, we are. Some of it is just about timing, and I talk to private equity firms or hotel investment firms in the course of my reporting, and these are, institutions or large-scale developments that are maybe they're not completely, oblivious to the climate risks. Maybe they know them full well, but they have determined that their investment time frame is shorter than the impact time frame, right? And so you see a lot of stuff happen in that space as well, which is this basic idea that we can make a couple $1 million or tens of millions of dollars on the coast of Miami now, and we're going to be long gone before the flooding really hits. Somebody else will be holding the bag when that happens.
Well, and I think it also, but both of you are saying, really underlines that point of these, climate haves and have-nots, and a larger, I think, a theme in the book of climate change exacerbating and showing us more that income inequality. And I'm thinking specifically here of, you say, it's that thrill-seeking that, where people are able to go and where. But you also mentioned in the book, until the 1950s when we had AC, right? The Gulf South was not nearly as habitable as we think of it now. And at the same time, certainly we have the luxury of staying indoors all summer if we want to here on Rice University's campus, which is lovely. But, we had workers in the street last summer one man who died of heat stroke who was doing construction labor. And so this, the discrepancy between those who have to work outdoors, who don't have access to air conditioning, who are in jobs where they're doing manual labor, and those who are able to, build condos and sell them off is stark and it's staggering. And I think it underscores what a lot of you're getting at in the book of this is only going to continue to drive these inequities.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned as one small example, the role of air conditioning in factories or in indoor workplaces in the South, which is part of what made so cheap home air conditioning and cheap construction materials are one big draw for large populations to move to hot places. But so was the ability to have blue collar workers work inside facilities, and that's nothing new in the South. But as we talk about climate migration and heat in general across the country, I think that one of the real soft spots in terms of equity and how this affects different people is the increasing need for air conditioning in mid-latitude or even northern latitude kind of facilities and work environments that have never had them, and where it's actually surprisingly difficult logistically to put that infrastructure into buildings. And this is one way where I think the spread of heat from the South towards the North, which is going to happen even as the North is relatively better off, is also going to continue to really punish that working class and labor class disproportionately.
So because you bring up the North, and as we're starting to move towards running out of time a little bit here, I really want to jump over to, the happier part of this, if there's a happier side, which is just, you do stress there are opportunities for us to engage. We were discussing this a little earlier as well around how we think of what is this future we're preparing for. And if we start addressing that now, that it really lets us, get a running start towards rethinking these communities. And you give some really interesting examples about people who are really doing fascinating work in some of these kind of Great Lakes communities and across some of these northern belts, where they're thinking around climate resiliency, but also preparation for waves of migration and how that's going to reshape their cities. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little about those examples, and then maybe selfishly I'll redirect us to Houston after that to think a little bit about what that might mean in a city that, is certainly not going to be listed as a climate haven, but is going to continue to see explosive growth for a long time. We are a city of migrants, and that shows no indication of stopping. But I'd love to hear some about what some of these other places are doing as models of building more climate resilient, migration ready places.
Yeah. So, big picture, what the slices of data that I looked at in my reporting suggest is that for all of the negative impacts in the South, some of those impacts are going to be much more positive in the North for obvious reasons. Their winters will get shorter. Their average temperatures higher. Crop yields in rural places are projected to increase while they're projected to decrease in the South. So farming and agricultural industries in general might see growth, and then if you buy into the concept of large-scale climate migration, then those urban areas will also see an increase in population. And, to the same extent that Miami wanted to grow for all of its economic benefits, that's an opportunity now for those cities in the north, many of which have excess capacity because they peaked their populations with the fade out of old industries in 1970 or so. And so they have, space and land and infrastructure and roads and, and other sorts of capacity to fill. And so there are people in some of those places who are beginning to think about, what this means from two perspectives. One is, how can we capitalize on it? I get an email every other month from the city of Buffalo, New York, framing itself as a climate haven. Come to Buffalo. It's good for business. It's good for long-term living. It's not as cold as it used to be, and and as you all migrate, this is going to be the place to be. And similarly, there's planning and architectural and urban planning groups thinking about what this means for places like Detroit, for Ann Arbor, Michigan, a smaller town, but is very progressive in thinking about this, and places like, like Duluth. And what those places are recognizing, it's early days in this process so far, but is that there's the opportunity for economic growth if they play their cards right. And to play their cards right, they need to do a whole lot of work. And a lot of that work is just, the same old work that our cities have always needed to do, but now with more urgency in a shorter time frame. But, better housing, better schools, better receiving infrastructure and facilities for the communities that are going to arrive there. Because if you have those things, then that community can be more dynamic and more resilient. And if you don't have those things, the opposite is true. It can spiral downward with more crime, more conflict, more friction between haves and have-nots, and so forth. And so, in places like Michigan, there is a recognition that they are likely to see a reverse in their demographic trends. They don't know exactly when or how to plan for that. I talked with the city of Ann Arbor, for example, that was passing a bond measure to replace a sewage treatment plant, and they were looking to oversize it by 10%. So that kind of like long range planning, of really putting their money down on this issue, and creating infrastructure, solid infrastructure that would be there to support people when they come. And I think that's again, early days, but I think that is the future, and that's what you're going to start to see in cities across the country.
With some interesting, cultural opportunities, but also conflicts to come. And this is something that comes through in the book as well, that it's one thing to talk about infrastructure, and it's another to think about, well, what is that city once it starts becoming different people? And that's going to be, and especially in a country where some still have the sort of fear or terror that there are those trying to kind of batten down the borders and invade. But in fact, we're going to be looking at much more richly mixed cities as a consequence, I would think.
Yeah. So one of the greatest pressures, I think, or challenges for all of these cities, is going to be how you manage the gentrification that inevitably is a part of this whole equation. I spent a lot of time reporting in Atlanta, which is kind of a model for how this gentrification is happening. But I think you can see it almost anywhere. You have new communities that are coming in. You have, improvements that the city wants to make, new parks, new infrastructure, all of these positive things by environmental standards. But one effect of those is that it raises the attractiveness of the area, and it changes who can afford to move in. And so one crucial part of the planning process is to anticipate that, and I think protect those communities that are in those places now, so that they're not economically displaced. And to the bigger picture of conflict, you're right. America's not immune from the kind of migration-driven conflict that we see in Central America or that we see on the U.S. border. We also see it in American communities, and there's a couple examples that I cite in the book. But what happened in Chico, California, after 30,000 people left Paradise, California, is very typical of the patterns that we see globally, which is that at first there is an outpouring of sympathy and every good intention to receive people and to shelter them and incorporate them into your community. But slowly the pile-on effects of that become more clear. In the case of Chico, it was subtle rises in crime. It was a loss of parking. It was pressure on infrastructure that was going to require investment that was going to raise local tax rates. And the welcome wears out, and soon, people are rejected instead of welcomed. And there's already examples of that across the country.
I mean, you directly highlight post-Katrina in Texas as a moment of, welcoming followed by backlash. I will say, as someone who first moved to Texas in the wake of Katrina, I felt both those things. I felt both remarkably welcomed and also, saw a lot of hostility towards folks who were coming in town and concerns about, things they had heard about fights breaking out at high schools and things. And it is a real lived experience and a really interesting place for us to kind of wrap up this conversation and thinking, I think, just about both the important work of recognizing long-term how we prepare for migrational waves, but also the difficulty of these stress moments where, as you mentioned, Chico with 30,000 people, hundreds of thousands post-Katrina, that's really difficult to prepare for. That's really hard, and I think is going to require significant state and federal kind of oversight, thinking about how we handle moments of mass migrational change. But yeah, all right, big question to leave us on here. But we so appreciated you joining us for the program. Abrahm Lustgarten is the author of On the Move, The Overheating Earth and the Uprooting of America. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
We'll now go to our researcher, Sienna, who has different ways to get involved around Houston this week.
Hey everyone, this is Sienna coming to you with some upcoming opportunities to get involved. Today, I'll be spotlighting 3 different activities for this Earth Month. First up, we have Memorial Park Conservancy. They're hosting a volunteer day this Friday, April 26th from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. Located at 6502 Arnott Street, this event beckons all Houstonians to join hands and hearts in the care of one of our city's most treasured natural spaces. Their volunteers are also an integral part of the restoration and maintenance of the park. Volunteers would engage in a variety of hands-on tasks aimed at enhancing the park's ecological health and beauty. Whether it's clearing trails, planting native species, or tending to garden beds, there's plenty to be done. They also encourage volunteers to pack essentials like water bottles, snacks, sunscreen, bug spray, and gardening gloves. Closed-toed shoes or boots and long pants are required. Parking is available at the fitness parking lot at 6502 Arnott Street for $2 for 3 hours. Meet in the center of the parking lot, then walk to the work site when you arrive. If you are interested in this event, be sure to sign up for one of the volunteer slots on their website. The website is memorialparkconservancy.org. Have questions? Feel free to email their team at volunteer@memorialparkconservancy.org or give them a call at 713-863-8403. They can't wait to see you there. Next up, we have Houston Arboretum and Nature Center's Earth Day celebration, set to unfold this Saturday, April 27th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Nestled at 4501 Woodway Drive, this free extravaganza promises a day filled to the brim with exploration and education for eco-enthusiasts of all ages. So get outside and learn about the amazing variety of animals and plants that share our planet. Challenge yourself with a scavenger hunt, explore interactive activities and crafts, and meet some awesome community partners who will share different ways of enjoying and supporting nature. The program will be held rain or shine, so please dress for the weather. Crafts will be available while supplies last, and no sign-up is needed for this event. And finally, let's not forget about the Buffalo Bayou Partnership's Climate Hope Earth Month Volunteer Day, also happening this Saturday, April 27th from 8:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. This collaborative effort, in tandem with Climate Hope, is dedicated to breathing new life into one of Houston's most iconic waterways, ensuring it remains a cherished legacy for generations to come. Volunteers aged 9 and up are invited to roll up their sleeves and dive into a range of rewarding tasks, from trash pickup to mulching and weed removal. They do ask that all volunteers bring their own work gloves. All other necessary tools will be provided by Buffalo Bayou Partnership. Ready to dive in? Signing up is a breeze. Individuals can secure their spot by completing the online waiver, while small groups can reserve spaces and larger groups can even schedule alternative volunteering dates throughout the month. Simply shoot an email over to volunteer@buffalobayou.org to make arrangements. And for more details, including the exact location, please reach out to that same email. And to sign up, go to their website, which is buffalobayou.org, and make sure to read the volunteer information packet and complete an online volunteer waiver with the event date. If you have any more questions, contact Steve Parker by email, which is volunteer@buffalobayou.org, or by phone, which is 713-752-0314, extension 206. So whether you're a seasoned eco warrior or a budding green enthusiast, these Earth Month events offer a golden opportunity to connect with like-minded individuals and make a tangible difference for our planet. So mark your calendars, rally your friends and family, and join us in celebrating Earth Month.
Thanks, Sienna. Next week, we'll be talking with Jackie Medcalf of the Texas Environmental Health Association about Superfund sites and pollution around Houston. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.